back in the 80s, there was a pretty massive television advertising campaign about "This is your brain on drugs." One of the advertisements was a woman holding a frying pan that would then start smashing everything in the kitchen and saying, "This is your brain on drugs." And that's going to be the basis of a series of these videos we're going to do called "This is your brain on," such as "This is your brain on the end of empire," "This is your brain on patriarchy," "This is your brain on trauma," "This is your brain on whatever. So the first in the series of "This is your brain on" is "This is your brain on the end of empire." And I want to start this by reading something by Edward Gibbon. He wrote, "The 5 marks of the Roman decaying culture: concern with displaying affluence instead of building wealth, obsession with sex and perversions of sex. Art becomes freakish and sensationalistic instead of creative and original. Widening disparity between very rich and very poor. Increased demand to live off the state." Now, before we go any further, I want to mention that he was writing this in the 1780s about what happened 1,000 years before that. This was not Nostradamus predicting, but it may as well have been. Because we see all of those in spades. And the point is, I'm going to read these, go through these one more time, and we see these, they are predictable effects, or predictable symptoms, predictable markers, predictable, he called them marks. They're predictable responses, attitudes. In any way, concern with displaying affluence instead of building wealth. And let's leave aside the problematical notion of building wealth, because building wealth within building wealth as it is normally discussed in both capitalism and basically in other forms of wealth as this culture understands them, involves stealing from the natural world, and it also involves quite often impoverishing others. But in any case, concern with displaying affluence instead of building wealth. Let's just say concern with displaying affluence instead of acting in a manner that is, no matter how you define it, productive for society. And you know, we see this often with, I don't know the numbers, but I have seen studies of how many children who inherit fabulous wealth, so often they kind of end up being little shits. I think we don't need to go further into that. Obsession with sex and perversions of sex. Same deal. I don't think we really need to talk about that. I will just mention queer theory. Art becomes freakish and sensationalistic instead of creative and original. Again, we can just look around at some of the horrors that that substitute for really great art. And we can also talk about the society of the spectacle, and how when you have, you know, in the Roman times, they had the Colosseums we've all heard of, and the Colosseums, the displays there had to become more and more horrific because people would get bored. And this is really fundamentally true. You know, I want to step back away from this, and I believe I mentioned this before, but it's really important that I first sort of understood the spectacle back when I read Randy Schilt's book, And the Band Played On, which is about the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. And one of the things he talked about was the bathhouse scene from the 80s, of which he was a participant. And one day he was walking out of a bathhouse, or he was in a bathhouse and walking out of the lobby or whatever, and he saw what looked like somebody sitting in a sling with someone else, an amputee, rubbing his amputated arm against the other person's behind. And it took him a little while to realize that the that was not what was happening. What was happening was that the one man had his entire forearm up inside the other man's rectum, colon. And what Randy Schultz talked about there is that if you remove emotion from sexuality and you remove um, relationship from sexuality, that removes a whole huge category of stimulation. And if you remove emotion and emotionality and relationship from sexuality, it can get boring, and you need to increase the stimulation somewhere. And so what he was getting at is that you had to increase it physically so that there was much more physical. It had to become more and more extreme. And we see this, of course, in pornography, where there is the old porn gets boring and it has to be more and more extreme. And it's not just in pornography. You see this in professional sports, where it used to be it was good enough just to go to the ball game, and now you have to have the jumbotron, and then you have to add something else, and then you have to add cheerleaders, you have to keep adding on and on and on, because otherwise it frankly gets kind of boring. And so this is, and the same is true with art, that the old, almost by definition, becomes passe, and you have to, just last night I was at my mom's and listening to the quote comedian end quote at the what's it called, the White House press correspondence dinner or whatever it is. We all know the one that Colbert really did a great job on many years ago. And she was swearing a lot. And I am not one to complain about swearing, since I swear a lot. Nonetheless, we see this in film. There's an advertisement on television right now, on regular TV, where somebody says that some barbecue is effing good. And when my mom and I heard that advertisement, she turned to me and she said, "Did he just say effing?" And I said, "Yes, he did." And the point is that is the spectacle too. You have to keep, part of the problem is that if you have a relationship, there is infinite complexity in that other person, in that land base, in that tree, in that other. There is a near infinite complexity. But if you're perceiving the other not as a being of infinite complexity, but instead as an object, as a surface, then you have to keep transgressing boundaries or things get boring. And this is a problem. And this is one reason that any culture based on objectification will end up atrocious. A widening disparity between very rich and very poor. Of course, we see this today. An increased demand to live off the state. Again, he's saying this in the 1780s, writing about 1,000 years earlier. So it's extraordinary that we see that as well. So this is one part of your brain on the end of empire. So many indigenous people have said to me that the first and most important thing that we need to do is to decolonize our hearts and minds. And I think that, I've spoken often of the importance of not perceiving the world as consisting of resources, but instead of other beings to enter into a relationship with. And I've spoken often of the importance of recognizing that this culture is destructive, and this culture is based on theft from the land, and is based on systematic theft from indigenous people, and is based on the patriarchal, theft of theft by males from females. And we need to recognize all that. And I think another part of decolonizing is recognizing the patterns of this culture and recognizing the patterns that come at the end of empire and recognizing them not only socially, but individually. So I'm going to read the Gibbon one last time, and let's think about how this affects modern society, and also think about how it manifests your own brain on the end of empire. So here is Gibbon one last time. The 5 marks of the Roman/American decaying culture: concern with displaying affluence instead of building wealth, obsession with sex and perversions of sex, art becomes freakish and sensationalistic instead of creative and original, widening disparity between very rich and very poor, increased demand to live off the state. And one of the important things to recognize is that this is not just you, but this is your brain on the end of empire.